It's been 100 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. So let's hold on for a minute and look at the cost and death and destruction this war has caused. It is almost unimaginable. The United Nations says that more than 4,100 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. That includes more than 240 children. Thousands more have been wounded, and the UN says both numbers are likely to be much higher, with areas like Mariupol still inaccessible. It's also hard to know how many soldiers have died. Russia hasn't released any figures recently, but the UK's defense minister says at least 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed. There's also little information on how many Ukrainian soldiers have died, but Ukraine's president says between 50 and 100 fighters are dying every day. The war has also pushed millions from their homes. The UN says more than 6.8 million people have left Ukraine since the war has started. Some have since returned, and millions more are displaced within the country. And then there's the destruction. More than 1,000 schools and hundreds of hospitals are in ruins, in addition to houses, roads, bridges and factories. It's widely agreed that the cost to rebuild will run into the hundreds of billions of euros. I'm now joined by our correspondent, Rebecca Ritters in Kyiv. Rebecca, an absolutely devastating 100 days for the Ukraine, but is it going to get even worse?
Well, Gerhard, almost nobody here believed that this war was going to happen. Now, here we stand 100 days into the conflict, and the conflict is entering a particularly grueling phase. On Thursday, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, warned Ukraine and its allies to prepare for the long haul, to prepare for the grueling war of attrition, as he calls it. And that is certainly what we're seeing play out in the east of the country. As we know, Kyiv was the big prize for Russia when they stormed in here on the 24th of February. They wanted to take the capital and instill a new government. They failed in that. Everyone thought that Kyiv would indeed fall within 72 hours. But as we now know, Ukraine managed to hold out, to push back Russian troops from the capital. Then Russia, of course, regrouped and moved to the east. And that's where the fighting is taking place today. We are seeing this grueling war of attrition play out there as Russia slowly does advance. We're seeing some gains, just to give you an update of what's happening on the battlefield. We are seeing some gains, Ukraine managing to take back little pockets and areas, but it's very small back and forth. Russia not making huge inroads now, but they are looking like they will take that key city of Severodonetsk in Luhansk and be able to perhaps take Lysychansk, the sister city on the other side, though that does remain in Ukrainian hands at the moment. Once they've done that, they will be really in control of most of the Luhansk region of that area, and they will then try and take parts of the Donetsk, which make up that Donbas region, which is now their main aim in this war.
So, Rebecca, the 100 days of this war, much longer than expected. How do you explain this resilience of the Ukrainians?
They're incredibly resilient, I suppose. I mean, that word is always a bit difficult in these kind of situations. I mean, what choice do they have, really? They're being invaded, and they have to kind of stand together and unite and try and fight back. But they have proven to be incredibly resilient. And what is perhaps surprising and certainly pleasing to most Ukrainians is just how much they've united behind the war effort since it's begun. You hardly hear anyone being critical of what's going on here. Everyone's sort of behind, backing President Zelenskyy, even those who may not have voted for him or may not have been happy with him as going into this war. They now stand behind their president. They're very happy with the way that he has been handling the situation, the way he's been rallying the international community. And, that is something that is really helping with morale here.
Rebecca, you've been covering that war nearly since the very beginning. What are the more lasting impressions?
Well, there are several. I mean, I was here in the country a couple of weeks before the war broke out, actually, and I went home thinking, oh, this isn't going to happen. Like many people here, most people told me, we've been in a war already for 8 years. We don't believe that that Putin is going to send his troops in and try and take the country. But we were all proven wrong. And I would say that the lasting impression really is that unity that I'm talking about. You know, Ukrainians really united, pulled together, and it's really an incredible thing to see. Another thing that really strikes you when you're here, I mean, particularly in Kyiv, is just this sort of juxtaposition, this sort of sense of calm in the city at the moment. I mean, obviously that wasn't the case as troops were surrounding the city, but now, you know, a couple of months into this war and has pushed back troops, there is this sort of calmness here. Life is returning almost to normal in the capital, or at least it's got a sense of normality to it. And that is really strange to think. Just a couple of kilometres rather down the road, you've got all of this, you know, death and destruction on the battlefield. So that is another really kind of oddity of war.
Rebecca Ritters there reporting from Kyiv. Thank you, Rebecca. And as Rebecca mentioned, the fiercest fighting is now centred on Severodonetsk in the Donbas region. In a late-night video address on Thursday, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy gave this assessment of the situation in the east of the country.
The situation in Donbas has not changed overnight. We've had battle success in Severodonetsk, but it's too early to tell how it's going. The situation there is tough, as is the situation in nearby cities and towns such as Lysychansk, Bakhmut and others. The Russian army uses all of its available armed capabilities.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy speaking there. Now, for more, let's cross over to our military analyst, Frank Lebwich, who joins us from Oxford in the UK. Frank, I'd like to ask you the same questions that I asked Rebecca earlier. Is this going to get worse for the Ukrainians?
Well, let's look at things in the larger context. The Russians went into this wanting a war of annihilation, which would take 15 days. We now know that was their planning assumption. And what they've got is a war of attrition that is likely to take 1 or more years. On the plus side of the ledger, they have taken the city of Mariupol on that southern coast, which does threaten Ukraine strategically. But on the negative side, and rather more significantly for the moment, they have essentially reduce the conflict down to that Donbas area, which is now their immediate objective, an area they've been looking to take for the last 8 years and are focusing really their entire combat effort on that. So that's where we are now.
Talking about that region, fighting is now concentrated there, especially around the city of Severodonetsk. How decisive is this battle in the grand scheme of things?
Gerhard, I think this is one of many battles to come. It's even one of many battles in this phase. What the Ukrainians are doing is using the opportunity in Severodonetsk to attrit Russian forces, something they've been doing now for the last 3 months, and grind them down and continuing to dish out casualties. And what they're not doing is treat it like a fortress city, as they did in Mariupol, which they had to do that anyway. So this is not the sort of end battle, the last battle, or even particularly decisive. They will, as Rebecca said, move on to Lysychansk and possibly even further, as President Zelenskyy said, further west. So it's one of many battles, even in this phase.
So, Frank, many, including yourself, when we talked about this topic earlier in the war, were surprised at the, let's say, underperformance of the Russian military at the outset, resulting in heavy losses. Have they learned from their mistakes now?
Well, as one general said recently, if you're going to learn under fire, indeed learn at all, and there's a whole field of study of military learning, you need 2 things. You need a solid training culture and military professionalism, all wound up and directed by excellent leadership. And the Russians have none of those things. The raw material they have is extremely poor, and it's getting poorer as they're taking further casualties. It does seem that they're learning something, but if you're continuing to feed virtually untrained personnel in large numbers, or perhaps not even as large as they need, into a grinder, then you're not going to get a good result. So Russia is learning, but not very quickly. And that's why it's making the same mistakes again and again and again. Lack of professional culture.
Now, Ukraine said they prepare for a counter-offensive sometime in June. Losing Donbas now, recapturing it later, is that a feasible strategy?
Well, Gerhard, I'm not too sure they will lose all of Donbas. They will, as the UK Ministry of Defence, it has to be conceded, said today, they're likely to lose the Luhansk area. Whether they can move on to take the rest of into Donetsk is highly questionable. But we are where we are. That's the current objective. And I suspect what will happen is, at some point in the next few weeks, Russian momentum will stall, and they will declare some kind of victory, which places the initiative then in Ukrainian hands again.
Our military analyst Frank Lebwich there. Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you, Gerhard.
Now, Ukrainian prosecutors say they've identified thousands of cases of war crimes committed by Russian forces during the invasion. They include execution-style killings, the rape of women and children, and torture. Authorities in Kyiv are determined to bring the perpetrators to justice. As DW's Terry Schultz reports, there are means to do this, but it will not be easy. A warning, this report contains images some viewers may find disturbing from the start.
100 days of war, more than 15,000 alleged war crimes, and a crime scene spanning virtually an entire country. Bucha, Irpin, Kharkiv, Mariupol. International investigators want to see the perpetrators in another city as soon as possible. The Hague.
We all know who are responsible for this war, for these deaths, for everything what is going on in Ukraine. Of course, it is President of Russian Federation and his team, actually, who started this war, who started to kill civilians, rape civilians, tortured civilians.
Alleged atrocities which, if proven, are war crimes. While the prospect of actually getting Vladimir Putin and his military commanders into a courtroom may seem remote, Ukrainian prosecutor Irina Venediktova has unprecedented resources to reach that goal.
I feel, I trust, and I hope that with my international colleagues, with international community of lawyers, we can speak about justice. We need justice. We want accountability.
A new joint investigation team headquartered in The Hague is cooperating to seek justice in a range of settings. In Ukraine, where there have already been convictions. In the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is gathering evidence on the ground. And in at least 10 European countries, using a mechanism called universal jurisdiction.
I think this is what is needed for crimes of the magnitude that we often see at the ICC. We have to join hands in the common interest of humanity.
Evidence from the various investigating teams, from Ukraine or other national governments to the International Criminal Court, will all be deposited here at Eurojust, the European Union's judicial cooperation agency. Then all authorities will have access to it. But even with these joint efforts, war crimes cases could take many years because of their extremely high burden of proof. Human rights lawyer Lotte Leicht explains there's a quicker path to justice: prosecuting the crime of aggression.
It is a crime where leaders, people in leadership positions, make the decision to launch war against another country. Every bomb in Ukraine today, every shelling of a city or a town, every tank of a Russian tank active in Ukraine is a crime of aggression.
Leicht supports calls for another tribunal to be set up to handle these cases, likely under the human rights body, the Council of Europe. Ireland, the Council's current president, wants to do that by November. How much patience do Ukrainians have to see war crimes prosecuted? Irina Venediktova answers by recalling the horrors she's seen on the battlefield.
It's impossible to forget, it's impossible to forgive.
In other words, as long as it takes.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was quick to brand the Ukraine war a turning point. And this week he announced new weapons for Kyiv. 100 days into the war, new poll numbers are out showing what Germans think about their government's response. 29% say the German government is not giving enough military aid to Ukraine, while 42% think it is adequate. 23% say the assistance goes too far. The number of people answering adequate is up 7% from April. Well, for more on these latest poll numbers from Germany, let's bring in DW political correspondent Hans Brandt. Hans, how has German public opinion and the government's position evolved?
Well, we have to see that 100 days ago, when this war started, there was a huge wave of support in the German public and across the world, of course, for Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people went onto the streets to demonstrate in favor of Ukraine. And at the same time, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine started coming into Germany and other countries in Europe. So this initial wave of support still continues. But as the war has become longer and more complex, so has become the response. The response in Germany and amongst German politicians as well has become a lot more complex. At the moment, there is not just the question of supporting Ukraine, but the question of how to support Ukraine, and much of the issue centers at the moment around the delivery of weapons, what kind of weapons should go to Ukraine, and to what extent that would mean that Germany and other countries in the Western alliance would get involved directly in this war, which obviously they want to try and avoid. For the German public, at the same time, effects such as inflation are making themselves felt. So in German public opinion, there is some hesitancy now about how the matters are proceeding. At the same time, I think what you have to say is that in general, support for Ukraine remains very, very substantial in German public.
OK, of course, a big part of the shift involves people's view on Russia. Let's look at some of the poll's other findings. Germans were asked what stance the government should take towards Russia when it comes to supplying Ukraine with weapons. 50% think Germany should take a tougher approach, while 43% say Berlin should not do anything that would provoke Russia. That's a slight increase from 2 months ago. The poll also asked about sanctions on Russia. 41% think the measures don't go far enough. 37% say they are adequate, while 15% think the sanctions go too far. Hans, tell us more about how Germans' attitudes towards Russia vary across party and regional lines.
Yes, Russia is obviously the central issue, as it were, in all of this. And one can see that in the German political spectrum, support against very strong measures towards Russia, including weapons supplies, sanctions and diplomatic efforts, is strongest among the supporters of the Green Party, which is a surprise because that party has something of a pacifist past. Whereas the other major government party, the Social Democrats of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, their opinion is somewhat more split, with people, Social Democrats, feeling that Russia should not be provoked. This goes across to the far right of German politics, the Alternative for Germany party, which has a lot of support for Russia and is critical, very, very critical of the government stance towards Russia. And then if you look at the regions in Germany, the east of Germany and the west of Germany, the former Eastern Germany, the former communist Eastern Germany, surprisingly, one might say, support for Russia there remains much stronger than in the West. There, people still feel that Russia should be, in some sense, respected and that one should be careful about provoking Russia. The feeling is possibly that Russia used to be, in communist Germany, an allied country, and there might still be some feelings of friendship towards Russia there. At the same time, there is also a lot of support for the right-wing Alternative for Germany party in Eastern Germany. So that overlaps, I think, with some sort of respect for authoritarian rule, which one sees in Russia.
DW's political correspondent Hans Brandt. Thank you, Hans.